Now we're going to talk a little bit about energy. So energy has to do with the ability of causing a movement. So inside of a cell, when we're talking about what energy really is, energy can cause something to move. And movement is necessary. As soon as things stop moving, even not physically moving from one location to the next, but just talking about opening of an ion channel to allow sodium into the cell or potassium out of the cell and so forth, any type of movement, that's considered a release of energy, and that's considered life. So when movement ceases to exist, life ceases to exist. So with energy comes exergonic and endergonic reactions. Exergonic reactions release energy, so they give off energy. Anytime you break down something, you're releasing energy. In other words, you're producing energy from that. Endergonic reactions require energy. So anytime you build a substance, anytime you go through anabolism, that's going to require energy. And our energy molecule of choice is adenosine triphosphate. Adenosine has to do with a ribose sugar and adenine. Adenine is a base from DNA. If you remember the 4 bases of DNA, A, T, C, and G, adenine is the A. You can have energy that is cytosine, so CTP. You can have energy that is GTP. And since this is ribose, we have UTP as well. We would not have not commonly see TTP, although it's possible. So of these bases, we can produce different energy molecules, and there's applications for those in certain situations. But again, the most common form of energy that we use is ATP. We get energy from ATP by the breaking of the last phosphate. So breaking off of the last phosphate, ATP for adenosine triphosphate gets converted to ADP. And then inorganic phosphate I usually just indicate as a separate phosphate like that. So ATP, when you break off that bond, becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Now, in order to produce energy, we want to put that back together and go back to ATP. Every time we do something in the cell, we need something input into the system to get it back to ATP. There's different types of ways that we can go about doing this. Substrate level phosphorylation is the generation of ATP through a transfer of phosphate group from a phosphorylated compound directly to ADP. So you have ADP, and then you have some type of compound that's attached to a phosphate. And it just bumps into this guy and hands over a phosphate. That's how ATP is generated in glycolysis. In oxidative phosphorylation, this involves redox reactions. So in the electron transport chain, which we'll talk about in a little bit, you've got all of these different complexes inside of the membrane. So there's 4 complexes, and then there's this large ATP synthase, 5th complex. And you have a movement of electrons from one complex to the next. You have these hydrogen ions that accumulate inside of this intermembrane space. Eventually, the hydrogen ions flow back through the membrane, and those hydrogen ions combine with the oxygen to form water. This is a redox reaction that is coupled to the production of ATP. As these hydrogens flow through, this rotates, which causes the phosphates to be combined with ADP to make ATP. So again, it involves the bumping into a phosphate to ADP, but since it's coupled to an electron transport chain, we call it oxidative phosphorylation. Photophosphorylation, photo involves light. This is how ATP is formed through a series of sunlight-driven reactions in phototrophs. We'll talk about photosynthesis last. So aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is the process of producing energy using 3 steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle is also known as the TCA cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or the citric acid cycle, but we'll leave it at Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Overall, we end up with 36 to 38 ATP per glucose. And the microorganisms that can do aerobic respiration include some types of fungi, bacteria, archaea, protozoa, or protists in general, protozoa, and helminths. So we go through all 3 of these steps and we use oxygen. In anaerobic respiration, we still go through all 3 steps. So we go through glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. But this time we do not use oxygen. We still produce 36 to 38 ATP per glucose depending on how we produce it. And the organisms that can do this process are really just bacteria and archaea. Fermentation involves just glycolysis. And through fermentation, you produce 2 ATP, and then you have some byproducts or waste products. And the waste products include carbon dioxide and ethanol, or acid. The ethanol is how we produce alcohol in wine and beer and so forth. The acid, there's all sorts of different types of acids that can be produced, and we'll test for the presence of these different types of acids in some of our metabolic tests for diagnosis of infection. The microorganisms that can do fermentation include bacteria, archaea, fungi, and protozoa, and helminths as well. Humans. So what people do is the aerobic respiration, and we do fermentation. Some A&P textbooks will talk about anaerobic respiration in people, and that's not the correct term per se. So when we're talking about what microorganisms can do. True anaerobic respiration is talking about going through all of these steps, but then instead of using oxygen as your terminal electron acceptor, you're using something else. And usually it's going to be sulfur, so you end up producing H2S, and that's anaerobic respiration. People cannot do this process. Although sometimes you'll read textbooks and they'll talk about anaerobic respiration, it's really a misuse of the name. We go through fermentation. When we do strenuous exercise and our oxygen requirement for our muscles supersedes what's actually coming in, then we're going to switch to a state of emergency, and we go through the process of fermentation where we do glycolysis only to produce 2 ATP, and eventually we need to get oxygen into our tissues or we're going to die. The waste product that we produce from our fermentation is lactic acid, and that's why we have burning sensations in our muscles following strenuous exercise. That acid then has to be taken to the liver to be converted back to pyruvate and then make its way back into the cellular respiration cycle. So this can only sustain us for a short period of time. But there's some single-celled organisms that can live just by doing this fermentation process because they don't do a lot of stuff. They just kind of hang out. They don't even have to use flagella to swim. They're just present. And they're going to do their little bit of metabolic reactions, and the 2 ATP is enough for them. So aerobic respiration, all 3 steps, 36 to 38 ATP. We use oxygen. Anaerobic respiration, all 3 steps, 36 to 38 ATP, no oxygen. And fermentation, we just do glycolysis and we produce 2 ATP. This one, of course, is again no oxygen. Then we have photosynthesis. So in photosynthesis, you have the light-dependent reactions, the light-independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle, and your end product is food in the form of a sugar. So photosynthesis is not producing energy from the sun, it's producing a sugar from the sun. Photo, using light, synthesis, you're making something. What are you making? You're making a sugar. So it's the production of a sugar or of a food source from or using the energy from the sunlight. The microorganisms that can do this include some types of bacteria called cyanobacteria, algae, and then plants. I'm not going to write down plants because they're not microorganisms, but plants can also do this process. So if we reflect on what organisms can do what, bacteria can do every single type of energy or food production available. So bacteria have a wide range of capabilities. This doesn't mean that every species can do all of these processes. It just means that as a whole, bacteria can do the most stuff.